for those of you who don't know CoreIdea and don't know Howard and Mark, they were responsible for one of the largest recent medical device acquisitions. That's the billion-dollar-plus acquisition of Ardian, the renal denervation company, by Medtronic. But their story is really so much about so much more. So why don't we start talking a little bit about your backgrounds? And both of you actually kind of had invention in your blood, going back to your families. And
Yeah.
Mark, why don't we start with you and talk a little bit about your background, and don't leave out your grandmother.
No, I won't leave. I never leave out my grandmother. I'm sure she's. Nevertheless, I should probably start by talking about my father, who's an engineer and was a great inventor in his own right. He was involved in the processing of construction materials and invented quite a few things. So one of the stories that I love that my father told me about his inventions was at some point he was asked to look into the grinding process for cement and cement mills, and he couldn't figure out how to tell when the process is over. And he listened, and he found that some operators were doing it much better than others. This was 1950s, long before the computers and analytics. And he found that some operators were more productive than others. And when he asked them what they were doing, they were listening to the mill. And when they were listening to the mill, they found that the pitch of a mill changes when cement reaches certain fineness of ground.
And let me add, because of your strong New York accent, that might give it away, but this was not in New York.
No, it was not in New York at all. I was born and raised in the country that doesn't exist anymore. It's called Soviet Union. It's now, in St. Petersburg, yes. It's so that my father did is brought a microphone and a recorder and a spectroscope to the mill, and he recorded the sounds of the mill, and later on created a closed-loop system to control the mill based on the sound. And to me, that means enormous amount. You have to know how to listen and how to look and where to look if you want to see inventions. A lot of invention is the art of observation. That is a lesson I learned. And shall I talk about my grandmother? You want to embarrass me?
And your grandmother actually had roots in medical device invention.
Indeed, as a patient. But see, and I now realize she had heart failure and sleep apnea. And at the time, of course, I had no idea. I was a child, but I know that she was always fighting with those diseases that were poorly treated at the time. They're still poorly treated. And among other things, she invented a suspension harness in which she slept at night because she found that actually, Howard explained to me later that it had a sound physiologic background. So she made it out of rubber bands and she slept in the suspension and it relieved her pain. She could get a good night's sleep. It prevented airway collapse and redistributed fluid. So,
talk a little bit about when you came to the U.S. and how you got involved in the device industry.
Oh, I needed a job badly, so that was the reason. But no, I had absolutely no background in medicine. I came to the U.S. in 1987, and I needed a job. And a friend of our family, one of my father's graduate students, was at the time at Johns Hopkins University. And I interviewed with them on the hope of getting a job. And they were looking for an engineer because at that time in the medical devices, the regulatory environment was becoming tighter. And you couldn't just do experiments on people like you did in the 1970s. So there are institutional review boards which said that you need to have this thing called investigation device exemption. And I said what it is, and they said, well, to have an investigation device exemption, you need to have engineering and people who can do risk analysis and submit plans and drawings. And so they were looking for an engineer, and I happened to be there at the time, and I was cheap. So they hired me. And that's where I met Howard. Howard was a fellow in cardiology fellow at the same lab where I was engaged in. My first project that I was asked to develop was a machine to do cardiopulmonary resuscitation. It was a novel idea that was propagated by our boss, Myron Weisfeld, who was a very young chair of cardiology at Hopkins at that time, at the age of 35, I think. Yeah. And he was also a president of American Heart Association, very young. And the fascination they had was with improving resuscitation, which still has dismal outcomes. And so the idea was to create a device that would redistribute force, but then just generate better pressures, well, mechanical compressions of the chest. And we were very successful indeed in building a device and later testing it in a small clinical trial, and the publication in the New England Journal followed. And then Johns Hopkins University at that time never done a technology transfer. They were total virgin. And they said, that Stanford has been doing it, and, even Yale did it already. It's time we did it. And they were the last, I think. So they were looking for a first technology transfer subject, and they had some venture capitalists interested and said, what do we have? I said, well, we have this resuscitation device. Let's transfer it. And I said, well, why wouldn't I transfer with the device? Because as an engineer, I really don't have much interest in staying in academia. And that's how we ended up leading engineering effort on my first startup for the technology transfer company. Was called Cardiologic Systems. It did not succeed in the marketplace. It really, like many companies, was way ahead of its time and faced very formidable obstacles from FDA and real world. But it was a very good training for me. I've learned a lot.
But I have to say, because you're being a little modest here, Mark, the device actually, a successor to the device, is still used today as the assets of cardiologic work.
Absolutely. Chances are, if you are picked up, chances are, if you're in an ambulance, you will find it. It's called Life Belt or Life Autopulse. Thank you. Yes, yeah. It went through Restart by Free Arch, which were actually Dr. Tom Fogarty was the person who founded it, and Free Arch funded it, and later Zoll acquired it and commercialized it successfully 10 years later. I didn't make any money on it, but neither did Johns Hopkins.
Howard, talk a little bit about your background, and then we'll get to how the two of you met.
Sure. I'm a heart failure transplant cardiologist by training, and Mark and I again met in Mike Weisfeld's lab, who actually gave us the big idea concept, which we'll talk about in a minute. But basically, I was a cardiology fellow at the time, and again, I was poor. And Mark and I shared a desk in the Mike Weisfeld's lab, and we were damn lucky to have it, obviously in academics, right? We call our lab as really machine shop because there was a lathe and stuff behind us. So, but what we had the opportunity to do was to get really great exposure and do a bunch of things. And Mark and I started working together, again, because we were poor. There was a CRO that had a Holter device that was, and this was before heart rate variability really, kicked in and was widely available. And so they were looking for a new thing to sort of sell to Merck for a, a new feature that they could add as a thing. They were a Holter scanning company and a CRO. So they came to, we happened to meet them just by luck, and so they came to us and said, can we do heart rate variability? And we said, of course we can do heart rate variability. And we went back and looked, we had no idea what heart rate variability was. But, but when you're desperate, you need the $40 an hour. So, they were paying me as a physician $40, and Mark and I split the 20, and then we took 200 of it. And whatever it was, and then we found somebody that actually knew something about heart rate variability, asked them to help us write an algorithm, and then we sort of sold it back to them and made some money and supported ourselves. But, that's the way a lot of invention comes out of necessity and sort of, what's your dad say? Inventions are like fleas?
Yes, they come from poverty.
They come from, right. So, but again, Mark and I, we had a great experience. We worked on a lot of cool stuff at Hopkins together, and we're in the lab. And Mike Weisfeld used to have a lab meeting every Monday morning at 7:30, in which he said, "What did you do for me this week?" And if you didn't do something for him that week, it wasn't good. And if you did something, he said everything from great job to I don't know why I pay you. That's usually a bad day when they say I don't know why I pay you. So we then went back and met with him one day, and we were working on a project. We said, well, why don't we do this? And he says, why are you doing that? We said, we think it's a really interesting scientific project. He said, and this is where we learned what became sort of our core motto. He looked at us and he said, you know what? It takes as much effort to do a big thing as a small thing. And he said that you will be known, at least in academics, you'll be known for being the first one to find something. Leave it to everybody else to figure out the little details down the line. But be the first ones to find something really cool. And that actually led to my first patent, which was on an MRI-safe pacemaker. And we did it just out of necessity, because we were looking at we were funded by Medtronic, strangely enough. This is 1989. We're funded by Medtronic to look at their cardiomyoplasty device and why their therapy wasn't working. And in order to do it, we had to look at the contraction of a muscle in opposition to the heart in the MRI setting. So we had to develop a way to pace the heart at a constant rate and trigger the MRI scanner to do it so we could get the images we needed. So it was sort of, a lot of these things just come out of necessity rather than, it was really brilliant idea. But Mike said, why focus on, the little things, focus on the big things. So, that's been our mantra over time. And we're dinosaurs. Is the way I look at Mark and I. We're thank you. Yes, and you look like a dinosaur, so you know.
Well, let me ask you, another one of your mantras, which is somewhat counterintuitive, is that you really focus on system physiology. I say it's counterintuitive because I think there's an assumption on the part of a lot of people in this room and in the industry that is what physicians look at. And when physicians are looking to develop new technologies, the first thing they're going to really look at are the different physiology systems.
Okay, this is where I get
view of that. So talk about that.
Okay, so this is where I get myself in trouble. And this is where Mark's going to stand up and say, right. So this is where Mark's going to say, would you shut up and not say that again? But I'm going to say it again. So what happens is that, physicians are not scientists. You're not trained as a physician to be a scientist. 75% of all diseases your grandmother can treat, right? And the other 20% need a doctor, and about 5% you really need somebody who's thinking. But the problem is, whether it was 2,000 years ago and people said it was evil humors, or whether it was 1,000 years ago and it was whatever, or when I was training it was hemodynamic problem, or then it became genetic, then it became molecular, whatever. If somebody's grabbing their chest, it's their heart, right? And if you look at the EKG and this lead is pointing this way and this lead is pointing that way, that's an MI, right? So you don't want physicians to think. The reason is because the rationale changes every 10 years. So if you're trying to guess on what's happening to somebody based on the physiology that you learned 30 years ago, you're probably wrong. Therefore, what you really is a pattern recognizer as a physician, for the most part. And that's exactly what you should be. Now, that doesn't mean physicians aren't smart, doesn't mean all that kind of stuff. But, it's like every certain specialty has its own things that you have to learn the patterns for, and that's the most common thing. Nobody learned, physiology like Mark and I do went out in the 80s. And for different reasons. NIH wasn't funding it, this or that. Molecular and genetics became sexy, personalized medicine, the whole thing. And what happens, there's starting to be a swing back now towards it. But what we found is, and again, Ardian is one example, and some of the other companies we did are examples. It's really a question of there's usually some known but unexploited physiology that can answer a question. And what we generally look for are two things. We sort of assess things the same way VCs do. First is unmet clinical need. And that's what I think most physician inventors and engineers sort of miss. They say, I have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. What you need to do is find out what the unmet clinical need is and then find an answer for that problem. That being said, of course you're going to go through, who are the competitors, what's the IP, what's the technical risk, clinical risk, who's carrying the bag, what's the referral pathway, et cetera, to make a decision. But in the end, if you decide that the market's really large and there's something there, how do you approach it? The way we approach it, and everybody has their own way, the way we approach it is, I don't know if it's unique to us, but we like to look and say, okay, where is the drug failure? Find an unmet clinical need where drugs have failed. Okay, so that you found a no-option group of patients, because that's the only place where you can really make an inroads in medical devices, in our opinion.
We are very different from most technology incubators, and probably all of them, because We're really physiology oriented. We're not technology oriented. We try to find we try to find those physiologic pathways that are known but have not been explored or exploited for anything practical. Because we think there is already a lot of technologies, probably more technologies than needed, available. What ultimately markets, acquirers, patients, and society needs are more therapies. There's 700 known diseases, and 70 of them are curable. Obviously, we're not doing very well. The last time we cured something, was polio. So, nevertheless, we get new gadgets every year. So what we need is new therapies that address those big problems. There's still a lot of big problems that are not being addressed. And as Howard said, in the 50s, 60s, there was a great hope that the drugs will cure everything, and that hope kept building up. And we now are sitting in a situation where people are taking 15 different drugs. They're all interacting and making them feel worse than the disease would have. So obviously that hope was not fulfilled totally.
But I guess the real problem is it comes down to there's a real huge disconnect between what you need to do to have a large early stage idea and what funding is available. And let me just give a quick issue with this. So go back to 1950s. 1950s, hypertension was a surgical disease. Okay, there were no drugs for hypertension for real. And so people were taking out sympathetic chain. And they were taking out the sympathetic chain to reduce vasoconstriction and reduce blood pressure. Comes the 1960s, beta blockers were invented. So then sort of beta blockers started to take over because it's easier to take a pill than to have a major surgical procedure. But if you look in the literature in the 60s, it's all this argument over whether surgery versus drugs are the best thing for hypertension. Drugs got better. Everybody forgot about surgery. So comes now, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and resistant hypertension is becoming an issue. There's a large group of people who have high blood pressure, and 10-20% of all the people, whatever number you want to pick, aren't controlled on 3 meds plus whatever. They're on 5 meds, etc., and they're having a miserable quality of life, as well as strokes, etc., etc. So for us, we actually looked at it, and we were interested, strangely enough, we got into that, strangely enough, via a different pathway. We were looking at trying to control fluid balance in people with heart failure, which is sort of our passion. And one of the ways we looked at it was by trying to fake the kidney into thinking that it was in a normal state so that it wouldn't pump out all the things and turn on all the hormones and do all the stuff that it does to raise blood pressure or to retain fluid. So we got to this idea of getting rid of the renal nerves, and when we look back, we look through the physiology, and there's never a direct path. And that's what I think the problem is. It's like you learn one thing out of the neural literature, you learn one thing out of the cardiology literature, you learn one thing out of the renal literature. You just got to sit there and try and figure out how to integrate all of it to come up with this concept. So we came up with this concept, and we didn't know but we knew it would be good. We didn't know whether it would be good for heart failure, hypertension, or slowing the progression of chronic renal failure, but we knew it had potential in everything. So in early 2003, we're starting to shop this. And everybody says, you're crazy, there's no such thing as renal nerves, everybody says, no. Finally, we're able to license it to the foundry, and it's starting from there. However, it was originally meant as a heart failure device, and it was meant to improve fluid removal and salt removal from the body, because we thought that would be good. Turns out, when we started doing clinical trials, we saw these huge drops in blood pressure. And while we hypothesized previously that would be it, we didn't know. So what I'm saying is you never know till you do it. And this is the problem with VCs, that in the device world specifically, that they want to see a direct path from here to there on a certain timeline, and so I go from this drawing to this widget, and you're done. If you're trying to compete and get something that has a really huge valuation that is based, opens a new franchise, you can't go you don't know exactly where you're going to go from here to there. So it's very hard for us to find people that will fund on sort of physiological concept that will eventually become a device. We don't know exactly what all the different things you're lucky, you're going to happen to catch in the middle.
Well, let me also ask both of you to comment on, let's talk about Ardian, although it's, again, your most recent venture. I don't want people to think it's your only company, but, if you look at Ardian and renal denervation in the current climate, anybody who was over at Euro PCR recently saw that this was really renal denervation's coming out party, and the whole clinical theory underlying it has become well accepted, but that wasn't at all the case when you were developing this idea. And we're going to talk about this later in the big idea panel, but how do you balance out that need to kind of persevere and pursue these ideas while at the same time keeping your options open as far as what clinical area they will, as opposed to addressing the concerns and criticisms that you got from colleagues and others in the field?
The only way we got it was that you try and pick a physiological mechanism that addresses multiple large fields. So for us, in our current company, it's sympathetically mediated diseases. So sympathetically mediated diseases are heart failure, hypertension, diabetes, sleep apnea, various and sundry other
small problems.
Yeah, small problems. So you figured even if you end up with a small segment of one of them, you still have a very large market. That's the only way to sort of hedge your bets early on. But again, VCs don't like to hear that. VCs want that's the hardest thing is you come in and you say, this can treat this or this or this. And then the answer is, well, obviously you don't know what you're doing because you haven't chosen what you want to do. What I've noticed now, and what happened to us on our most current company, is that we have a drug VC that's funding us along with a device VC. And they sort of understand that concept more. But still, it's really hard. It's very difficult for classic device VCs to feel comfortable working in that environment.
I think one of the things that you do is you take this...
Or you can lie blatantly to them.
You do that a lot, but you reduce that big idea to one or two essentials that are immediately obvious, and they would maybe a subset of the market. I call it air conditioner theory, because when air conditioning was invented, nobody knew what to do with it, and the inventor had a really hard time convincing anybody to buy it. Until he ran into a gentleman from Alabama who had a chocolate factory, and in August and July his chocolates were melting. So for him it was not a proposition of hypothetical value. He knew exactly how much money he is losing on those chocolates. So strangely enough, with hypertension, I think we owe that starting push to Steve Shapiro from Wilkerson Group, later worked for ATV, who came up with the idea of using it to treat malignant hypertension. The hypertension that not only resists therapy, but is also symptomatic and totally unmanageable. And that was a subset that was big enough to convince. It says that no matter how difficult, is the procedure, we don't know what it will look like. We don't know how it will work. We don't even know if it's surgery or intervention, radiologist or cardiologist, but somebody will use it because the patients are desperate. So I think that was that initial moment, that there was some minimum market. If everything else fails, you can still sell it into that market and at least have some returns.
Well, you've both alluded to making that transition from coming up with a new idea, developing it, and then turning that into a company. The first place you guys did that was CHF Solutions.
Yeah, so
talk a little bit about, let people know what the company was about and how you made that transition to kind of get your feet wet in the medical device industry.
Yeah, I don't say this flippantly, but Mark and I had to sort of lose about $20 million of venture money before we actually learned what to do, and he did it with...
Another thing you should never say here.
I know, we're sorry. But we should yet again, one more. So, Mark did his first startup, which was Cardiologic, which came right out of Hopkins. I went from Hopkins to Columbia. I was the head of the artificial heart program with Mehmet Oz, and he's on TV now. See, I'm unknown, he's on TV. So what happens is that I left Columbia and went out to my first startup, which was an LVAD startup, of course, because I came out of artificial heart stuff, and found that I was exactly right academically, knew absolutely nothing about how to, be rational about, getting to timelines and deliverables and budgets and stuff like that. It did okay. It actually got a term sheet from St. Jude, and so that was okay. And, Mark's eventually ended up with Zoll. We went to then the first startup we did together. I actually want to say I saved Mark, because Mark was languishing, doing a year at Tyco Puritan Bennett, and his bicycle was rusting because of the salt on the water.
The Carlsbad in
San Diego, California. So I saved him from California and rusting his bike. What do you think? So, so we came back to New York, and Mark and I started a company called CHF Solutions, which was an ultrafiltration company, and that got bought by Gambro. But we learned a lot during that, too. What we learned during that is that the thing that stands out in my mind is, we did everything exactly right. We... On $9 million, we got to 510K approval, on time, on budget. We were at a show. There were so many people in the paint. There wasn't enough room in the booth for all the people. We're about to launch, and so we have this breakout session. And, we had all these marketing calculations about what our sales were going to be and this and that. And so at this breakout session, the woman who's the head of the heart failure at VA came up to me and says, "This is fantastic. I'm going to use this all the time." I said, "Fantastic. How often will that be?" She said, "At least twice a month." I'm going, "Twice a day, you mean?" "No, twice a month." And so this is where I sort of understanding the disconnect between what a really good idea is that'll work clinically, and you don't have reimbursement. I'm only going to use it on people that I can't do anything else on. And you know what? It doesn't fit into the way we do things in the hospital. So what was the issue?
We learned an enormous lesson of what we call now a market product fit. It's not enough for it to be a bad idea. It also has to fit with somebody's practice and somebody's reimbursement and somebody's technology and some acquirer's desire to buy it in the end and actually commercialize it. At the time of CHF Solutions, we didn't bother with those thirds. We just were focused, like most entrepreneurs of the time.
Great idea.
What will it do for the patients? Will it work? Is it a great idea? It was a great idea. It still is a good idea.
It works extremely well. All the patients thank you amazingly for having used it. It's extremely easy to use. Red button, green button, very low use. Of course, it's got reasonable sales, but why is it not used like $200 million worth of sales a year rather than tens of millions of dollars of sales? And the reason is that it doesn't fit with their practice. And this is where we learn this. Heart failure cardiologists give drugs. Also, heart failure cardiologists don't have a device budget. So there was no way for them to actually buy the device. Okay, they didn't have a budget to buy the device. And then on top of that, they didn't like extracorporeal blood circulation. Even though it was safe, even though it worked really well, even though it did all this, it was a hassle. And so when we went back and looked at, back in the day when we were doing this, so it was 2001. The DRG for heart failure at the time was like $6,900, something like that. And we figured out that if we could make $1,000 as a company, they could make $1,000 as a hospital, and you could get people out 2 days earlier if, when somebody came in fluid overloaded, you started the therapy right away. Now, the problem is that it was a $500 therapy versus $20 of Lasix. And so everybody said, okay, well, I'm going to try the $20 of Lasix first rather than pay your $500 device. Now, when you delay things by a day, you're no longer cost effective. Then we found that, it required a person who could put in a long IV called a PICC catheter in. And, in most hospitals, they leave at 5 o'clock. So if you came in after 5 o'clock, you couldn't get therapy anyway till the next morning. So all of these things sort of played into, it was a great idea, great clinical idea, but it never really sort of became a huge market success because it didn't fit into the way people used it.
Somewhere in the end, there was also a question of who will acquire it. And what we found is because it was extracorporeal blood circulation system with a little filter, like a tiny dialysis machine on IV pole, the organic acquirer for this technology was Gambro that monopolized 100% of acute dialysis at that stage. And Gamber had a pretty good idea of how much they're going to pay for that company, and they were willing to wait. So they said, we'll pay $50 million for this company. And the company said, no, we will start a congestive commercialization of this device, and we'll force you to pay $250 million. And, 5 years later, they came and said, well, we'll offer you $70 million for this company, because there was nobody else bidding or competing against
Well, there's another lesson that you guys learned, and that not every great idea needs to be a new company. And, Mark, you've talked about one of your favorite inventions actually didn't result in a company. Tell us about Renal Guard.
Well, Renal Guard was a passionate work, to some extent by us. We still never figured out if there is a big market. It was not a big idea. I think this falls into the category of elegant ideas, because at that time we were challenged by two independent events. On one hand, we got interested in the phenomenon of contrast nephropathy, when radio contrast that's used in angiographic procedures is actually nephrotoxic. In a small number of patients, particularly vulnerable older patients and patients with underlying disease like heart failure, can be rather badly injured. It's a low-frequency event, but it's expensive and it's nasty. And people who come for those procedures to the hospital, they're not looking to get their kidneys injured. They want to be cured from other diseases. So it's a bad side effect. At the same time, a company called PLC Medical, that was, for those who remember, a laser company in Boston that pioneered transmural myocardial revascularization, shooting lasers into the heart
For those of you who remember TMI.
Yeah, it was at some point that company had $1 billion market valuation. It went public, and then it went from $1 billion valuation to $10 million in the bank and no product. So this is when they met us, and they came to us and they hired us basically to find them a new opportunity, which would not be a big opportunity. They said they wanted a small niche opportunity that they could exploit, and where they will not have to compete with large companies like Abbott and Medtronic, and that we could execute the development process on the amount of cash they still had left from their public offering, which was very little, surprisingly, considering how huge was the offering. And so we took it as a challenge. It was interesting to see if we can do it. So we matched them to this contrast nephropathy opportunity, and then we said we shall find a technology or method to treat it. And we started with a blank piece of paper and said we started with physiology, because we were refining our method of thinking at that time. So for us, it was an exercise. And we said, well, let's find out why kidneys get injured by contrast. And very quickly, it became clear to us that the injury is primarily ischemic, because the contrast is high osmotic load and the kidney works very hard. It burns ATP, not filtration is a passive process. Active process that is metabolically intense is actually concentration of solute and excretion of solute. And when suddenly in the blood, it's a pretty dumb organ, it doesn't have much intelligence to it. So when it suddenly has a lot of osmotic load that somebody injected in, it hectically tries to get it out. And it's also viscous, and they will have jeopardized oxygen delivery. So this perfect storm is leading to acute renal injury, basically acute renal failure based on medulla, which becomes ischemic. And then we start thinking, well, how do you deal with that? And there were a number of companies at that time addressing the problem. They're trying to extract contrast, and they were trying to do this and that. Develop new contrast molecules that are all bad because they're all solute by definition. What can
But one other thing before you said, this brings out one other thing. The reason we actually ended up picking it is because Fendolipam, which was, I think it was Abbott.
Yeah, there was a drug failure.
There was a drug failure. And what happens is they spent an enormous amount of money educating all the physicians about contrast nephropathy and this and that, went through their phase 3 trial and failed with Fendolipam. So they had already prepped everybody to the problem.
Yes, the problem became known thanks to them. Otherwise, it wouldn't be. And also the physiology was explored. So there were basic scientists who actually did all the groundwork, finding out what are the mechanisms of injury. But nobody really reads those papers. Maybe that's how, certainly not in the device world. In the device world, we have catheters. So what we decided to do is take a counterintuitive approach and said, well, what if kidney didn't have to work hard? What if we reduce the metabolic demand in the kidney? Maybe the injury will not occur. So we found that if you dilute urine dramatically, if you have to excrete huge amounts of water, the counterintuitive solution that the kidney actually works lighter because it doesn't concentrate anything. It's just the convection takes the material out.
Right. So the more you pee, the less the kidney works. It's really a counterintuitive thing. People don't understand that, but
yeah. Nevertheless, yes, thank you. But nevertheless, so what we came up with is a very simple and elegant device, which consists of two parts. It has a Foley caster and an IV, and it takes the excreted fluid, measures the weight of the volume of the fluid, and injects back into IV normal saline in the amount just equal to what was excreted plus a little bit more. This way you maintain the vascular volume constant, but you basically rev the kidneys into excreting more and more. It's like chasing the tail, a dog chasing its tail. So it's trying to chase its own excretion rates, and you keep adding fluid and you keep diluting the contrast. So you can rev urine or excretion rates to 1-2 liters per hour. And, what happened, we tested it in animals, we tested it in humans. It was really simple, and it worked. The contrast nephropathy started going away, and companies doing clinical studies, they had no money that was picked up by the cost of clinical studies in Italy was actually picked up by academia and government in Italy, I think.
Right, so now it's approved in a number of European countries, and it's sold in a number of European countries, and we get royalties from a number of European countries. This is really nice.
But it was not the big idea.
I want to get to how, after starting companies and then after licensing technology like Renal Guard, you guys then start CoreIdea. But I also want to bring anybody who has any questions into the conversation, so feel free. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting, and before you get upset, let me finish everything I'm going to say. Today, your venture companies and your angels basically want to invest not in a great idea that has no management and the potential ability to implement. They'd rather invest in someone who they believe can implement the idea, even if it isn't necessarily the greatest idea. I suspect everything you keep saying is, we learned this, we learned that. We did this wrong, we learned that. My gut feeling is that if you guys were starting today, you might not be investable because of what you don't know about the implementation aspect of it.
Correct.
Okay? And I think the message really here is that it's more than the idea, it's implementation. If you don't, personally, if you're the scientist and you don't know how to implement, you better get people on board to do it. And now taking it to the first thing, and maybe this is where you're going, the idea of a venture capital company investing in a company that really doesn't have the path to the end is totally against what they would do under almost every circumstance, unless the people they're investing in are people who have proven that this process can work. So I think most people sitting here, I'm sorry, if they follow the advice that you're saying is get a product that has multiple possible outcomes, diseases, etc., would not be investable, and they have to get together with someone, a team, or someone who has. It's a hard investment for a venture capitalist to make. So I'm at cross purposes in what you're telling me. I'm not trying to be negative, but I think you're here talking to people who are looking to start a business or are in the process, and you're giving a strong message. But I think
no, you're absolutely right. No doubt, you're correct. So let me put in the CoreIdea. No. Let's just talk about how we do CoreIdea. Okay, so we sort of presented the scientific geeky type of approach to things and how we think about things. And I think that's one approach, and maybe it's somewhat unique to us, whatever. But we can't just do, like you said, we can't just do scientific geek. If we come to a VC and say, here's a really cool scientific idea, we'll never get funded. And so we have to do the same thing that anybody would have to do and lie, correct. But after you've lied, then you got to produce. So what is it? Don't tell the whole truth. Right. Don't, as my grandmother said, never lie, but don't butt in with the truth sometimes. So, but you're absolutely correct. VCs want to see a definitive plan, and that's what I was saying before. So what do? We're not really an incubator. What we are really is a separator. Okay, so what we do is we take a number of ideas. So let's say in the last thing we did, we had 2 VCs that put in X amount of dollars, okay, essentially for seed. And then what we did was to say, okay, we took 25 ideas, and started to evaluate them from their market, from, all the things you would from any standard VC thing. What's the unmet need? what's the clinical risk, technical risk, all the stuff I said before. And basically you're trying to whittle it down to, if everything worked, would this be a good business? And is there a plan? Is there an acquirer? What's your likely exit, et cetera, et cetera. Once we get down to, out of 25, we came down to 4 ideas. We end up trying them in the lab. We try them in the lab. We try and develop a device. We file IP, and, what do they want? You just can't come with an idea. You got to come with defendable IP. You got to come with a clinical plan for how you're going to go from today through approval. You got to come with, a plan on, engineering, what are the engineering issues, how you're going to get around them, and all the other stuff. So it's a lot of work. So it takes us a year and a half to go from, I sound really cool with a really cool idea, to actually having a thing that we're going to spin out to become a Series A company. So you're absolutely correct. And, for somebody that's just trying to start out, doing what we're doing, you can't do. What you need to do if you're going to be in the device area is do something that is, I don't want to say me too, because it doesn't have to be me too, but go ahead.
If you have a big idea, there's still a question of expectations. And there are incubators, and that's what incubators do. They take ideas and they turn them into business plans and implementation plans.
Syncor, Foundry.
They always exist. Some are excellent. We went to Foundry at some point with renal denervation because really it was over our head. I mean, they were very well.
They were the only money that was available.
Yeah. Plus, they really knew what they were doing. It was their 8th venture. It was our first. So they had the experience and the track record and everything that it takes to make it happen. And we realized that we will have to live with significant loss of control and loss of equity and loss of everything if we want to see this idea go. We believe that idea was big enough to justify doing that. If you want to maintain control of your idea, it's probably an illusion. A big idea will not allow you to maintain control.
Right.
So it's better to agree from the very beginning that it's not going to happen.
We're right up against time. Are there any other questions? And these guys are going to be around for the rest of the afternoon, so you should feel free to kind of talk to them during the break. But I do want to get on to one last area, which is one hot topic that's on everybody's mind is emerging markets, specifically China. And you guys have experience working with China. Mark, you've developed a device for China. So talk a little bit about what your experience there has been.
Remember all the things you're not supposed to say.
I understand.
About China, okay?
I remember that.
Yeah, please do. Nothing is as difficult as this. Try to describe our experience with emerging markets. We came very early to the realization that a lot of difficulties that we see here, which is lack of expanding market, rising tides that lifts all the boats. They don't exist in the markets like China and India, but the other problems exist there. I don't think that true innovation has its space there yet, because when you actually go to those markets, there's so many opportunities for investors to make money without really taking the risk of early innovation. And there is no culture of early innovation. I think that we're still in a stage when, for markets like China, is getting closer to the source. They're adopting technologies earlier in the pipeline, but not so early that you could call it early stage by our standards of Silicon Valley, for example. So I think it's way too early to take it. Well, I have a bright idea that's never been tested. I'm going to commercialize it in China. I don't think this will happen. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's good. In today's environment, all of the VCs that are playing in China right now, everybody sort of says we want to do this sort of big thing, fit for China, China only type thing. In reality, all the money is going into what the low-hanging fruit is. So where can I take something that was a generation ago and fit it and bring it into China and get a manufacturing line up and actually sells. So there's really more of, can I make a pacemaker that fits for China? Can I open up renal dialysis clinics in China? Can I do it? That's where the money's going into right now, and appropriately so, I think, for a lot of those VCs. We do an enormous amount of, almost all our clinical work is done OUS. Because we believe that most of the markets now, initial markets are OUS. And then coming back to the US is a second thought for a lot of people. And there's not that the hurdles for the FDA equivalents there are a lot less. They're just on a more timely basis.
Yeah, but what we think is opportunities in China, we learned it the hard way by trying to sort of push innovation there, and Harvard invented charity conference there. And in their incubators and funds, the opportunities are probably in taking tested technologies and adapting them to the needs of the specific market. We've heard many complaints from Chinese physicians in nephrology, cardiology, that they don't want the pacemakers that Medtronic is trying to sell them. They want the pacemakers that are designed for their patients and their needs.
But look at the dialysis thing. The big question with dialysis, for example, there, it's a great example of the problem in China. Right now, they've implemented the Western model. 3 days a week, dialysis machine, 4-hour session, the whole thing. The problem is they have a totally different cost structure there. Bricks and mortar cost nothing. Manpower costs nothing. So why are you tying yourself into this, 4-hour whatever? You could do much better dialysis, much more cheaply with much simpler machines, made specifically for the China market. But nobody wants to do that. Everybody just wants to drop in and once you put in that legacy, it's hard to back out of that legacy because you have an installed base and all this kind of stuff. So.
Well, great. Well, it's a great story. I want to join me in thanking Mark and Howard for being here. And like I said, they'll be around if people have additional questions.